My wicked stepfather hurt me a lot every time my mom wasn't home. Until one day I couldn't take it anymore, and I called 911 asking for help. My stepfather is harassing me, I shouted. Please come rescue me. I have everything recorded. Minutes later, he started shaking. The sun was just peeking through the window when Clara, moving silently, began clearing the dishes from the night before. Her hands, small and slightly trembling, tried not to make any noise. Every sound, every small clink from the ceramic seemed like a whisper that threatened to break the house's calm. Clara knew that Ricardo, her stepfather, didn't tolerate mess or noise, especially at this hour of the morning. Her mother, Lucia, was still asleep in the room next door, unaware of Clara's routine and what happened when she wasn't around. As she passed by the table, Clara reached for a glass that was on the edge, wobbling. Her heart pounded, wishing to avoid disaster. But in an instant, the glass fell to the floor and shattered into pieces. Clara froze, watching the fragments of glass scattered across the floor like tiny broken stars. She barely had time to react when a heavy shadow appeared in the kitchen doorway. It was Ricardo. His expression was cold, and his eyes looked at her with a mix of fury and disdain. He advanced slowly, each step a reminder of the power he held in this place. Clara felt fear creeping over her, but she said nothing. She knew that speaking would only make things worse. "What did you do now, girl?" Ricardo's voice was low, but with a sharp tone that made Clara lower her gaze. "I'm sorry, it slipped. It was an accident," Clara responded, her voice barely audible. Ricardo let out a dry laugh, full of irony, and stepped closer until he was right in front of her. He leaned in, and Clara could smell the tobacco mixed with last night's coffee. He grabbed her chin and forced her to lift her face to look him in the eyes. "Listen to me carefully, Clara. There are no accidents here, only mistakes. And you seem to be quite the expert at making them, right?" he said, squeezing her chin harder. Clara felt a sting on her face, but she held back the tears. Ricardo had made it clear that he didn't like crying, that he considered it a sign of weakness. Lucia always said that Ricardo just wanted to teach her responsibility, and Clara had resigned herself to the fact that her mother would never truly understand what happened when she wasn't around. "I'll clean up," Clara whispered, hoping those words would calm Ricardo's anger. He released her face and crossed his arms, watching her with a cruelly satisfied expression. "You better. And make sure there isn't a single piece of glass left, you hear me?" he warned. Clara nodded quickly, lowering her gaze, and hurried to pick up the pieces from the floor. Ricardo stood in the doorway, supervising her every move, as if he enjoyed her nervousness and fear. As she gathered the last fragments of glass, Clara couldn't help but think about how her mother's life seemed to be in the hands of someone so different from her. Lucia, who was warm and hardworking, who told her bedtime stories and hugged her when she had nightmares, would never suspect the monster Ricardo turned into when they were alone. Every time Lucia mentioned how grateful she was to Ricardo for helping to raise Clara, the girl felt a sense of abandonment, a deep sadness she didn't know how to express. When Clara finished cleaning, she prepared to return to her room to get dressed. But before she could leave the kitchen, Ricardo spoke again. "Don't think you're done here. You see all this mess," he said, gesturing widely around the house. "You're going to clean until everything is spotless." And this time, not a single noise understood. Clara nodded. Her heart raced, but her body moved as if it was used to obeying without questions. She didn't know how much longer she could endure this routine, but every time she thought about asking for help, something inside her shrank. Ricardo had made her feel alone, like no one would hear her. Later, when the clock struck 8, Lucia came out of her room, surprised to see Clara sweeping the floor. "Honey, what are you doing cleaning so early?" she asked, with a soft smile and a face still marked by sleep. Before Clara could respond, Ricardo stepped forward, embracing Lucia with an affectionate gesture that made Clara look away, feeling a knot in her stomach. "Clara wanted to help me with the house today, darling." I told her it wasn't necessary, but she insisted. "She's a responsible girl, isn't that right, Clara?" Ricardo said, looking at her with an expression that allowed no contradiction. Clara nodded in silence, feeling how Ricardo's lie spread through the room like a dark cloud. Lucia, oblivious to the tension, gently stroked Clara's hair. "How sweet you are, my love. How lucky I am to have you and for Ricardo to take such good care of you," she said, smiling without noticing the hidden pain in her daughter's eyes. Clara looked at her mother, trying to find the right words to tell her what was really happening. But Ricardo's gaze, relentless and penetrating, stopped her immediately. Lucia would never understand the hell her daughter lived through when she wasn't around. She wouldn't suspect that, under the facade of a protective father, Ricardo was capable of turning love into fear, subjecting her to a silent prison. Clara swallowed and forced a smile, responding in a low voice. "Yes, Mom. I'm lucky," but her words were lifeless, as if they were hollow. Lucia, satisfied, went to the kitchen to prepare breakfast, while Ricardo stayed watching Clara, who continued cleaning in silence. The girl, trapped between the need to protect her mother and her constant fear of her stepfather, realized that her only option was to survive in silence. There was no one to turn to, and the weight of that solitude would follow her throughout the day, every day. The sun was already lighting up the house when Clara, exhausted and hopeless, got up to continue her chores, knowing that no matter how hard she tried to please Ricardo, to him she would always be a burden, and her life, a shadow of what it could have been. The day began like so many others, with Clara trapped in a routine carefully designed by Ricardo. Her world was a silent, tense cage where every breath, every movement had to be calculated. Ricardo made sure Lucia continued with her daily work, far from home, without any reason to question what was happening. This man was a master of appearances, a skilled manipulator who crafted an idyllic version of himself, one that only existed when Lucia was around. When Lucia said goodbye that morning, Clara watched her from the window, her sad eyes fixed on the car as it drove away. She felt that her only chance to ask for help vanished each time her mother crossed the door. As soon as Lucia's car disappeared from sight, Ricardo slowly turned to Clara, his expression shifting from a seemingly kind smile to a cold, calculating stare. "Are you watching to see if someone's coming to rescue you?" he asked, his words dripping with acidic sarcasm that made Clara press her lips together. "You should know by now that no one will come." Clara lowered her gaze, holding back the urge to respond. She had learned not to challenge him. Any act of defiance would only result in crueler punishments. She decided to focus on cleaning, on remaining invisible. "By the way, last night you forgot to dust the shelves," he said, pointing at a piece of furniture in the living room. "You can't even do that right. How useless." The insult hit her like a whip, but Clara remained calm. She knew that responding would only make things worse. Ricardo approached her and, without warning, whispered something he had never said before. "You know, I could tell your mother that you're a problem. I could tell her you behave badly and don't obey me. And if I decide to do that, she'll believe me, not you." Clara felt a lump in her throat. Ricardo was threatening her with the one bond that kept her going, her relationship with her mother. For an instant, doubt invaded her mind, wondering if her mother would really prefer to believe Ricardo over her. The thought filled her with a deep fear, a terror that went beyond physical threats. What if her mother abandoned her? What if she saw her as a burden? Seeing the impact of his words, Ricardo smiled with satisfaction. His goal was clear. He wanted Clara to feel trapped, with no escape. Each time he made her shrink in fear, he felt his power over her increase. Throughout the day, Ricardo dedicated himself to giving precise instructions and watching Clara with an unhealthy intensity. The tension in the house was suffocating. Clara kept cleaning, folding clothes, organizing every corner, while her thoughts became a whirlwind of suppressed emotions. There was a mixture of fear, but also a contained anger she didn't know how to express. In the middle of this stifling silence, something happened that she would never have expected. Ricardo received a call. When he answered, Clara could only hear fragments of the conversation. What caught her attention was the tone of voice with which Ricardo spoke, a soft, almost kind tone, one he never used with her or her mother. With a mix of curiosity and wariness, Clara tried to listen more closely. Ricardo turned his back and began speaking quietly, saying words she couldn't fully understand, but which sparked something in her, a strange intuition she couldn't process. A few minutes passed, and when he hung up, Ricardo returned to the living room and looked at Clara with a smile that froze her blood. He said nothing and went back to his tasks, but Clara felt that something had changed. Although she didn't understand what, she could sense that this man was hiding darker secrets than she imagined. A few hours later, Lucia returned home. Clara, despite what she had experienced that day, felt relieved to see her mother, as if her mere presence dispelled the heavy atmosphere in the house. Lucia hugged her upon entering, and Clara clung to her, wishing she could tell her everything, ask her to protect her, but fear took over, and the words were trapped in her throat. Ricardo, watching the embrace between mother and daughter from the kitchen door, seized the opportunity to intervene. "Lucia, darling, Clara was a bit rebellious today. I think she needs more discipline," he commented, feigning concern, while casting a stern look at Clara. Lucia looked surprised and glanced at Clara with mild reproach, though her tone was gentle. "Clara, you know Ricardo only wants what's best for you. You shouldn't give him trouble. He's here to help you," said Lucia, convinced of her husband's words. Clara felt betrayed, as if her own home were a strange place where no one listened to her. Ricardo smiled, pleased to see how his manipulation worked perfectly, how he could entangle Lucia in his lies, keeping her unaware of his true nature. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. The fragments of the conversation she had overheard, Ricardo's threat, and her mother's words intertwined in her mind, creating an anguish that left her breathless. She thought about what he had said, about how he could convince her mother of anything, about the ease with which he molded reality to his will. She realized that if she didn't find a way to escape, she might lose her mother forever, or worse, she might be trapped in that house with no chance of help. It was then that she made a decision. From now on, she would try to gather evidence of what was happening. She knew it was a risk, but it was the only way to expose Ricardo and protect her mother and herself. Clara nodded silently, forcing herself to hide the fear and sadness she felt. She watched her mother leave the house, unaware of the hell that would unfold in her absence. As soon as the door closed, Ricardo's expression changed. The coldness and contempt returned to his face as he turned to look at her. "Go to your room. And don't come out until I tell you," he ordered with an icy tone that allowed no argument. Clara obeyed without saying a word. She walked slowly to her room and closed the door behind her, the sound of the lock echoing in her ears like a sentence. She turned on the hidden camera she had concealed behind a book on her shelf, and the faint blinking of the device filled her with hope. She knew it was risky, but she needed to capture the proof that would reveal the truth of what was happening within these walls. A few minutes later, Ricardo burst into the room. His face was twisted in disgust and barely contained rage. He approached Clara with slow, menacing steps, and she felt a chill run through her body. Though she tried to stay calm, the fear was overwhelming. "What are you doing here? Hiding like a rat?" he asked, his tone cutting through the air. Clara took a deep breath, trying not to let panic take over. She knew she had to act carefully. "I was just reading," she murmured, avoiding his gaze. Ricardo watched her with a piercing stare, as if he could see right through her lies. Without warning, he reached out and yanked the pillow away. In doing so, he uncovered the phone hidden beneath it, and seeing it in his hands, Clara felt her whole body tense in terror. Ricardo turned on the phone and started scrolling through its contents, his expression shifting from confusion to dark fury as he found the recordings. Clara watched him with wide eyes, unable to move, trapped between fear and helplessness. In an instant, Ricardo looked up, his eyes filled with a rage Clara had never seen before. "So you've been recording me?" He spat with a low, menacing tone. Without giving her a chance to react, Ricardo slapped her so hard that the impact knocked her onto the bed. Clara felt a sharp pain in her face, but she didn't cry or scream. She had learned not to show weakness, not to give him the satisfaction of seeing her suffer. She slowly got up, feeling the heat of the slap burning her cheek, but looked at him with a courage he didn't expect. "You think this will save you?" Ricardo asked, his voice filled with disdain as he waved the phone in the air. "No one will believe you, understand? No one's going to listen to a lying, manipulative little girl. I can tell your mother whatever I want, and she'll believe me. Me, not you." Ricardo's words pierced Clara's chest like daggers, but a spark of anger began to burn within her. She knew he was trying to break her, to make her feel alone and powerless. And though the fear was real, so was the truth. She knew what he had done, and even if he tried to destroy the evidence, he couldn't change reality. Seeing the defiance in her eyes, Ricardo tightened his grip on the phone as if he were about to crush it. But then, with calculated calm, he smiled with a chilling coldness. "You know what? I'm keeping this," he said, slipping the phone into his pocket. "That way, I can show your mother how you're trying to ruin our lives. I'll tell her you're out of control, that you need help. And when she sees you as a threat, it'll be you who ends up alone." Clara remained silent, her gaze fixed on him, trying to hide the trembling of her hands. Ricardo, noticing that his threat didn't have the intended effect, stepped closer again and whispered in a venomous tone, "There's no way out for you. And as long as you keep trying to defy me, things are only going to get worse for you." With those words, he left the room, leaving her consumed by pain and fear. Clara stayed there, in silence, feeling the burn on her cheek from the slap. Tears wanted to fall, but she forced herself not to cry. Ricardo wasn't going to win this battle. She had lost the recordings, but not her determination. That night, Clara understood that it didn't matter how many times he tried to destroy the evidence or make her feel small. There was something inside her, a spark that couldn't be extinguished. She knew her life would never be the same, but she also knew she was willing to fight to the very end. The days that followed the discovery of the recordings were an unending nightmare for Clara. Ricardo had intensified his surveillance, turning her life into a hell of threats and silent punishments. Every time Lucia left the house, he seemed to transform, as if possessing her secret gave him absolute power over her. Clara knew she was being watched more closely than ever, and although fear consumed her, she also felt a latent anger, a desperation she could no longer contain. That night, after enduring hours of insults, threats, and silent corrections from Ricardo, Clara decided she wouldn't wait any longer. The only way to escape was to ask for help, and she would do it no matter the consequences. When night fell and Lucia went to work, Clara waited in her room until she was sure Ricardo was asleep in the living room. She crept silently to the kitchen and took the landline phone, dialing the emergency number with trembling hands. She felt her heart pounding, as if it were about to burst out of her chest. Hearing the operator's voice, she could barely hold back her tears. "Help, please. My name is Clara," and her voice was just a trembling whisper. "I'm in danger. I have recordings of what he does to me. Please come." The operator asked her to stay calm and remain on the line while they traced her address. Clara barely managed to nod when a noise behind her made her freeze. Ricardo was standing in the kitchen doorway, his face hidden in shadows with a restrained expression of fury. She tried to hang up the phone, but he lunged forward and ripped the receiver from her hands. "What do you think you're doing?" he whispered in a dangerous tone, slamming down the phone. Clara felt fear paralyze her, but Ricardo didn't stop there. With a harsh movement, he grabbed her arm and dragged her into the living room, ignoring her pleas and desperate attempts to break free. He shoved her onto the sofa, his gaze filled with a fury Clara had never seen. She knew she had crossed a line, and for the first time, Ricardo wasn't hiding his hatred. "You thought you could make me look like a monster, didn't you?" he said, approaching with terrifying calmness. "What did you hope to gain from this, Clara? Your mother will never believe you." Clara felt tears start to well up, but she held his gaze, even though her hands trembled in fear. "She'll believe me. When she hears everything, she'll know the truth," she said, her voice breaking but resolute. Ricardo laughed bitterly and leaned closer, his fists clenched. "Do you hear yourself? Do you really think you can handle this?" he taunted her. "I control this house, and you're just a pathetic little girl." At that moment, sirens could be heard approaching. Ricardo turned his head toward the window, and his face turned pale. The fury in his eyes turned to panic, and Clara felt a flicker of hope. The police had arrived, and now someone would see what was happening behind the closed doors of her home. Ricardo tried to maintain his composure, turning toward her with a twisted smile, trying to regain control. "Remember what I told you, Clara," he whispered. "If you say anything, I assure you, your mother will never forgive you." The knocks on the door grew louder, and the voice of a police officer broke through the silence. "Police, open the door." Ricardo hesitated for a second, giving Clara one last look before opening the door. The officers entered and asked him to step aside, scanning the room cautiously. Clara took the opportunity and approached them, her voice shaky as she tried to control her fear. "Please, help me," she said, without daring to look at Ricardo. "I have proof that he hurts me. I can show you." One of the officers nodded and asked her to speak calmly. Ricardo, however, tried to interrupt. "This is ridiculous. Clara has behavioral issues. She's always been a difficult child. She's probably making this up because she's angry with me," he said, with a calculated smile that made the officers pause for a moment. Clara felt her heart break, seeing Ricardo's ability to manipulate the situation, but she held on to her courage. "I'm not lying," she insisted, looking the officers in the eye. "I had proof on my phone, but he deleted it. Please, check his phone. You'll see I'm telling the truth." The officers exchanged glances and asked Ricardo to show his phone. He attempted a laugh, keeping his calm demeanor. "I have nothing to hide, but this is a waste of time. Clara has always been a troubled child," he said, handing over the phone with a dismissive smile. One of the officers took the phone and began to review it. The tension in the room was palpable. Ricardo maintained a cold expression, but Clara could see a spark of desperation in his eyes as the officer went through each file and conversation. Suddenly, the officer found a folder containing the recordings. Ricardo tried to speak, but the officer raised his hand, signaling him to remain silent. As the audio played, voices filled the room. The insults, the threats, Ricardo's cruel tone. Lucia, who had arrived without knowing what was happening, heard the recordings and stepped back, horrified. "Ricardo, what is this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ricardo tried to approach her, but the officers held him back. "Lucia, darling, she's manipulating you. This is all a setup to tear us apart." "You can't believe her," he pleaded, trying to maintain the image of a loving husband. Lucia looked at Clara, then at Ricardo, and back to her daughter, her eyes filled with tears. At that moment, she understood that the truth had been in front of her all along, but she had never wanted to see it. "How could you?" she murmured, with a mixture of pain and anger. Realizing his mask had fallen, Ricardo tried to resist, but the officers cuffed him and escorted him out of the house. Clara, exhausted, collapsed onto the sofa while Lucia looked at her, her face filled with remorse. She approached her daughter, embracing her, and silently cried. "Forgive me, Clara. I couldn't see what was happening," she said, her voice choked with pain. Clara, though hurt and exhausted, felt a deep relief hearing those words. That embrace, after so long, was all she needed. She knew the path to recovery would be long and painful, but at last, she was free from Ricardo's shadow. Both of them remained silent, understanding that this moment marked a new beginning for their lives. The silence in the house was almost absolute. Ricardo's presence, which had dominated every corner with his control and manipulation, was no longer there. Yet that silence wasn't peaceful. It was like a void, a space filled with everything Clara and Lucia now had to face. That man had cast a shadow over their lives, and though he was no longer present, his traces lingered in every corner of the house. Clara stayed in her room, looking out the window without really seeing anything. Her mind was still trapped in the recent events, in Ricardo's voice as he tried to justify the unjustifiable, in her mother's reaction when she discovered the truth. She felt the weight of what had happened still pressing down on her, a weight that even Ricardo's absence couldn't entirely relieve. Still, a small spark of relief and hope was beginning to ignite in her heart. Meanwhile, Lucia sat in the living room in silence, her gaze lost. Ricardo's words, her daughter's cries, the recordings, everything returned to her mind like a recurring nightmare. It was hard to accept that for so long she had lived with a man capable of hurting her own daughter. She kept asking herself over and over how it had been possible, how she hadn't seen anything. The guilt suffocated her, and each time she tried to find comfort, Clara's voice echoed in her memory, "She'll believe me." Those words, spoken in a broken but hopeful tone, were now like a constant echo in her mind. Finally, Lucia stood up and went to her daughter's room. As she opened the door, she found Clara sitting on the floor, hugging her knees with her head resting on them. Lucia approached slowly and sat beside her, saying nothing at first, allowing the silence between them to speak for itself. "I don't know where to start," Lucia whispered, her voice trembling, broken by guilt and pain. Clara slowly lifted her head and looked at her, her eyes reflecting a mix of exhaustion and sadness. "You don't need to say anything, Mom," she replied in a low voice. Lucia took her hand, holding onto it as if she were afraid her daughter might disappear. "Yes, I need to. I should have listened to you. I should have seen what was happening. You tried to tell me so many times, and I didn't want to see it. I failed myself, and I failed you, Clara. I don't know if you'll ever be able to forgive me." Clara felt the tears start to gather in her eyes. She had spent so much time fearing that her mother wouldn't hear her, fearing that she would abandon her emotionally. Now, seeing her mother acknowledge all the harm her silence had caused, gave Clara an unexpected sense of relief. "It hurt, Mom. It hurt a lot that you never saw what he was doing to me, and..." Clara lowered her gaze, as if it was still hard to talk about everything. "Sometimes I thought that you'd never believe me." Lucia wrapped her in her arms, holding her tightly, and in her embrace conveyed the weight of her regret and the desire to heal together. Clara allowed herself to be held, feeling the warmth of her mother comforting her, sensing that the invisible barrier that had separated them for so long was beginning to crumble. "I know it won't be easy, Clara, but I promise I'll be here for you," Lucia said, holding her tightly. "I'll get help for both of us, and we'll do whatever it takes to heal. No one's going to hurt you again, I promise." The days that followed were difficult. Visits to therapists, police interrogations, curious looks from neighbors and acquaintances trying to understand what had happened in that house. Clara and Lucia lived in a blend of sadness and hope. Clara attended her therapy sessions with a quiet bravery, allowing the pain to come out little by little, facing memories she had tried to block. She knew it would be a long process, but she also knew she was willing to walk that path. One afternoon, as they were returning from a therapy session, Lucia and Clara passed by the park where they used to go when Clara was little. Lucia looked at the empty swings, remembering the days when her daughter laughed carefree, before Ricardo entered their lives. That man had stolen something from them, and Lucia understood that only time would bring back the peace he had shattered. Clara sat on one of the swings, swaying slightly as she looked at the ground. Lucia watched her from a nearby bench, feeling that each of her daughter's gestures, each sad look, was a wound she had left open for too long. "You know," Clara said suddenly, breaking the silence, "I always thought I'd stay trapped in that house, that no one would come to help me." Lucia felt a knot in her throat and moved closer to the swing to sit beside her daughter. "I'm sorry, Clara. I left you alone when you needed me most. But I promise you'll never be alone again." Clara looked at her with a faint smile, filled with a fragile yet real hope. She knew her mother was committed to change, and although the pain was still deep, she also felt there was a path forward. "Thank you, Mom," Clara responded. "I just need you to stay here, to keep listening to me." They both stayed in silence, gently swaying on the swings, allowing the peace of the moment to wrap around them. They had gone through a devastating storm, but together, they were learning to rebuild, to find once more the light that Ricardo had tried to extinguish. They knew the path would be long, but they were now certain they would walk it together, facing each day with the promise that the past would not define their future. What did you think of this story? Tell us in the comments what you would do in a similar situation. We invite you to like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with your friends or family as a show of support. This motivates us to keep posting exciting stories nearly every day. Don't miss the next surprising narrative that's about to appear on your screen. We truly appreciate having you here with us. You can click on the links that are showing up on your screen right now. We have an exclusive selection of captivating stories and guaranteed entertainment just for you. See you in the next video. Take care.